There is a very specific, almost sacred kind of peace that a man expects when he finally turns off the main road, navigating the quiet, sun-drenched streets of Mission Viejo, California, pulling into his own property after pouring his soul into another grueling 80-hour work week just to keep a roof over his family's head. For me, the ultimate reward wasn't anything extravagant. It was simply the quiet sanctuary of my home, a place where I could retreat to my office, run my fingers over the cold metal of the new B360 Pro mainboard I had just installed, fire up my rig with its i5-941660T, and lose myself in the high-stakes, adrenaline-pumping tension of a PUBG match, watching every frame render flawlessly on my 180 Hz monitor. That driveway, perfectly paved, flanked by immaculate, dark green hedges that I trimmed myself every second Sunday, was the psychological border between the chaos of the outside world and the sacred, untouchable haven of my family's life, a boundary that I believed, in my naive, suburban optimism, was universally respected by any decent human being. But then, shattering that hyper-realistic, cinematic illusion of suburban tranquility like a rock thrown through a stained-glass window, there was Eleanor. I remember the very first time I saw it, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of a blindingly white, spotless Lexus RX parked dead center in my driveway, resting there with a kind of heavy, mechanical arrogance that made my stomach drop, not just because a stranger's car was blocking my access, but because of the terrifying implication that someone, somewhere, felt entirely comfortable violating the one space I had bled to provide for my wife and children. I stepped out onto the porch, the warm, golden-hour California sun suddenly feeling oppressive, my eyes scanning the pristine lawns of Cypresswood Estates, only to see a woman emerging from the shadow of my neighbor Margaret's porch, a woman composed entirely of sharp, judgmental angles, wearing oversized designer sunglasses, clutching a leather Prada handbag like it was a royal scepter, and walking with a slow, exaggerated sway that screamed of old money and unchecked privilege. I approached her, my chest tight, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level, dipping into that deep well of forced, polite professionalism I usually reserved for difficult clients, and pointed out, quite reasonably, that her vehicle was currently occupying the private property I paid a small fortune in property taxes to maintain. Eleanor simply paused, lowering her sunglasses to the bridge of her perfectly contoured nose, looking at me not as a fellow homeowner, not as a human being whose boundary she had just crossed, but as a minor, barely tolerable inconvenience in the grand, sweeping narrative of her life, before letting out a high, breathy laugh and declaring, with a wave of her manicured hand, that she was merely running in to grab a recipe from Margaret, assuring me she would be gone in a second, and then, without waiting for a reply, she simply turned her back, her heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete as she disappeared back into the house, leaving me standing there, emasculated and utterly astounded, a stranger held hostage on my own land. What began as a singular, infuriating incident quickly morphed into a psychological war of attrition, a relentless, grinding erosion of my patience, as running in for a second became her universal, impenetrable shield, her go-to justification for abandoning her luxury SUV in my driveway whenever she pleased, whether it was for a spontaneous wine-tasting afternoon with Margaret, a drop-off of some overpriced organic casserole, or simply because the shade from my ancient oak tree kept her leather seats from getting too hot in the suffocating Orange County heat. I tried everything. I really did, leaning into every ounce of diplomacy I possessed, begging her to consider my family, explaining that my wife needed to get our kids to their soccer practices, that I needed to commute, but every single plea was met with that same sociopathic smirk, that chilling, dismissive shrug, and a rotating carousel of utterly hollow excuses, punctuated often by her chillingly calm assertion that I wasn't using the space anyway, as if the vacant asphalt of my private property was a public utility awaiting her benevolent occupation. Desperate, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of sheer injustice pressing down on my chest, I turned to the one institution designed to prevent this exact flavor of suburban anarchy, the Cypresswood Estates Homeowners Association, scheduling a meeting with the president, a perpetually sweating, terrifyingly conflict-averse man named Arthur Pendleton, who sat behind his faux mahogany desk, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, only to inform me, his voice trembling with bureaucratic cowardice, that while her actions were morally questionable, there was technically nothing in the bylaws expressly prohibiting unauthorized, temporary driveway usage, effectively giving Eleanor a gilded, rubber-stamped permission slip to continue her reign of vehicular terror, leaving me alone in the dark, my blood boiling, my family's peace of mind shattered by the constant, looming threat of her white Lexus. The breaking point, the absolute zenith of this slow-burn tragedy, arrived on a crisp, hyper-focused Tuesday morning, a day where my career hung in the balance, a massive deadline looming over my head that required me to be at the office an hour early, only to pull open my front door and find not just her car in my driveway, but her car parked horizontally, angled with a kind of predatory, calculated malice that completely boxed my car in, trapping me, threatening my livelihood, my ability to provide my sanity. I hammered on her door, my knuckles bruised and aching, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. I called her, I texted her, my fingers shaking as I typed out desperate, furious messages, watching the clock tick down, feeling the walls of my own life closing in on me. And when she finally emerged, over an hour later, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee, looking at my panicked, sweating face, she actually had the gall to smile, a cold, dead smile, and ask, in a voice dripping with mock, theatrical sympathy, if I was trying to go somewhere. Something inside me, some vital, load-bearing pillar of human tolerance, simply snapped, disintegrating into dust, and in a voice so calm, so devoid of emotion that it frightened even me. I told her I was calling a tow truck, to which she scoffed, rolling her eyes to the heavens, daring me to do it, utterly convinced of her own untouchable invincibility, completely unaware that the man standing before her was no longer a polite neighbor, but a father pushed to the absolute brink. I made the call, my eyes locked onto hers, and when the heavy, diesel-guzzling tow truck from South Coast Towing finally rumbled down our street, the glorious, almost symphonic sound of the heavy steel winch engaging, the horrific, metallic scrape of her pristine Lexus being violently dragged onto the flatbed under the bright California sun, it was a moment of pure, transcendent catharsis, a desperate clawing back of my dignity. As I stood there, watching her pristine mask shatter, her sophisticated facade melting into a screaming, red-faced, terrifying tantrum, her arms flailing, her voice screeching obscenities that violated the quiet morning air, screaming about lawsuits and police, while her precious vehicle, the chariot of her entitlement, was hauled away into the distance, leaving only the smell of burnt rubber and the intoxicating, dangerous realization that the war had finally, truly begun. If I had foolishly believed that towing her car would be the end of it, that the profound financial and public humiliation of watching her luxury vehicle carted away would humble Eleanor, I was dangerously mistaken, because the rage that radiated from her in the days that followed was palpable, toxic, and utterly consuming, a dark energy that seeped across the property line, manifesting in passive-aggressive glares, whispered insults to other neighbors, and a tense, suffocating atmosphere that made my wife nervous to even let our children play in the front yard, transforming our home from a sanctuary into a besieged fortress. The towing had merely addressed the symptom, a temporary bandage on a gaping, bleeding wound of boundary violation, and as I sat in my darkened office late one night, the soft, ambient glow of my 180 Hz monitor illuminating my face, I realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that playing by the rules of polite society was a losing game against someone who fundamentally did not believe those rules applied to her, and that if I wanted to protect my family, if I wanted to reclaim the absolute sovereignty of my own land, I had to do something permanent, something undeniable, something so breathtakingly petty and structurally immovable that it would break her spirit completely. The idea came to me not as a thought, but as a vision, a cinematic, hyper-realistic blueprint of a massive, imposing, beautifully constructed brick wall, severing my driveway from the open street, a physical manifestation of the word no, an architectural middle finger pointed directly at her entitlement. The very next morning, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of espresso and righteous indignation, I dove headfirst into the labyrinthine depths of the city of Mission Viejo municipal zoning codes. poring over property line statutes, easement regulations, and aesthetic neighborhood guidelines, discovering, to my absolute, breathless delight, that while the Cypresswood Estates HOA had a paralyzing amount of red tape regarding paint colors and mailbox styles, there was a massive, gaping loophole regarding decorative landscaping and property beautification barriers, meaning that as long as I kept it under a certain height and pulled the right city permits, there was absolutely nothing Arthur Pendleton or anyone else could do to stop me. I didn't just want a wall. I wanted a masterpiece of defensive engineering, so I hired Harrison, a grizzled, leather-skinned master mason from Pacific Coast Masonry, a man whose eyes twinkled with a chaotic, knowing amusement when I unrolled my highly specific, overly engineered blueprints across the hood of his truck, detailing not just a solid brick barricade, but a sprawling, aesthetically flawless structure of rich, dark red clay bricks, bound by thick, reinforced mortar. When the heavy machinery rolled into my quiet cul-de-sac the following Monday, the deep, guttural roar of the cement mixers and the rhythmic, metallic clanking of the bricklayers' trowels felt like the beating drums of an advancing army, drawing the bewildered, terrified gaze of the entire neighborhood, and most importantly, drawing Eleanor out of her house, her eyes wide, her jaw practically unhinged in a rictus of sheer, uncomprehending horror as she watched my crew begin to trench out the entrance to the driveway she had so arrogantly claimed as her own. For 4 glorious, sun-baked days, I watched as my monument to petty justice rose from the earth, layer by layer, a solid, impenetrable wall of undeniable boundaries. But the true genius, the absolute crowning jewel of this massive undertaking, was the gate, a colossal, custom-forged, wrought iron behemoth, designed with swirling, Gothic elegance, sweeping arcs of heavy black metal that looked like they belonged on the entrance of an ancient, guarded estate, culminating in an electronic, heavy-duty keypad that pulsed with a faint, intimidating red light. It was wildly excessive, completely out of place in our modern, cookie-cutter suburb, an over-engineered fortress door that served absolutely no practical purpose other than to violently, permanently lock Eleanor out of the space she had abused, programmed with an access code that only my wife and I possessed, a code I specifically chose as the date of the towing incident, a little internal joke that brought a dark, satisfying smile to my face every time I punched it in. The true climax of this architectural warfare arrived on a Friday afternoon, right as the contractor was packing up his tools. The mortar finally set, the heavy iron gates swinging shut with a loud, authoritative, echoing clang that sounded like a prison door slamming shut on Eleanor's delusions of grandeur. She had been away in Napa Valley for a few days, presumably drinking overpriced wine and complaining about me, and when her pristine white Lexus finally rounded the corner, rolling slowly toward her house, I stood on my front porch, arms crossed, my heart hammering against my ribs in a primal, thrilling rhythm, watching as her brake lights flared a violent red, her car coming to an abrupt, jerky halt right in the middle of the street. I could see her through the windshield, the sheer, paralyzing shock washing over her features, her eyes darting frantically from the heavy brick pillars to the impenetrable iron gate, her brain clearly short-circuiting as it tried to process the impossible reality that her convenient, free parking space had been completely, violently erased from existence, replaced by a cinematic, hyper-realistic fortress of spite. She threw the car into park, practically leaping out of the driver's seat, her face a terrifying, mottled mask of purple fury, her designer heels clicking frantically on the asphalt as she stormed up to the property line, grabbing the heavy iron bars of the gate and shaking them, the metal refusing to yield even a fraction of an inch, before she tilted her head back, her voice cracking, echoing through the quiet streets as she screamed, demanding to know what I had done, accusing me of madness, of spite, of declaring war, to which I simply smiled, a cool, detached, infuriating smile, and told her, my voice echoing back through the bars, that I was just passionate about property beautification, asking her if she liked the new landscaping, watching with deep, profound satisfaction as the last remnants of her arrogant composure shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the sidewalk. The desperate, flailing counterattack came almost immediately, a chaotic, multi-pronged assault driven by a woman whose entire worldview had been shattered by a pile of bricks and some iron, starting with the frantic, sweat-drenched arrival of Arthur Pendleton, who came practically sprinting up my newly paved walkway, clutching the heavy, leather-bound Cypresswood Estates HOA rulebook against his chest like a holy relic, his voice trembling as he babbled about community aesthetics, visual disruptions, and the absolute necessity of maintaining neighborhood harmony. But before he could even finish his nervous, breathless tirade, before Eleanor, who was lurking just a few feet behind him with a smug, expectant smirk, could utter a single word of triumph, I calmly reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily stamped manila folder, dropping it onto the hood of his car with a heavy, authoritative thud, revealing the completely bulletproof, legally binding, meticulously approved construction permits from the city of Mission Viejo, documents that explicitly categorized my massive, intimidating fortress as a Class A decorative landscape feature. Watching the blood completely drain from Arthur's face as he realized his precious bylaws were utterly useless against the sheer, impenetrable armor of municipal law, forcing him to turn around, defeated, leaving Eleanor stranded in the wind, her ultimate weapon neutralized. Refusing to accept defeat, blinded by a toxic cocktail of humiliation and rage, she escalated the situation to a level of profound absurdity, dialing 911 and summoning the Orange County Sheriff's Department, forcing two heavily armed deputies, Deputy Miller and Deputy Davis, to pull their cruiser up to the curb, their lights flashing, stepping out into the suburban heat only to be immediately bombarded by Eleanor's screeching, incoherent accusations that I was illegally blockading her vehicle access, holding her hostage, and terrorizing the neighborhood. It was a beautiful, deeply poetic moment of justice when Deputy Miller, a towering, no-nonsense veteran, slowly looked at my pristine, legally permitted wall, looked at my heavily secured gate, and then turned his stern, exhausted gaze down to Eleanor, explaining in a slow, patronizing tone usually reserved for unruly toddlers, that I possessed the absolute, undeniable constitutional right to secure my private property, that she had zero legal standing to park on my driveway, and that if she continued to waste police resources on a civil landscaping dispute, he would personally arrest her for misuse of the emergency dispatch system, a threat that finally, permanently silenced her, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, trembling, isolated, and legally broken. But I, driven by the lingering ghosts of the stress she had inflicted upon my family, was not quite finished, needing to ensure that the psychological victory was absolute, which led me to purchase a high-end, discreetly hidden, motion-activated tactical speaker, burying it deep within the newly planted bushes right next to the property line, wiring it to trigger the moment anyone stepped within 3 feet of the brick wall. For the next 2 weeks, every single time Eleanor dared to walk past my house, every time she even cast a hateful glare toward the gate, a booming, robotic, highly articulate voice would echo across the quiet lawns, stating, "Warning, you are approaching a private, secured family residence. Please step away." A relentless, technological haunting that made her jump out of her skin every single time, turning her into a nervous, twitching wreck, the neighborhood's walking punchline, a woman terrified of a hedge. Her absolute final, desperate act of retaliation was an exercise in pure, unadulterated madness, as she waited for the dead of night, creeping onto my property like a thief, clutching a can of cheap, neon green spray paint, intending to deface the beautiful brickwork that had become the symbol of her ruin, entirely forgetting that a man who builds a fortress also installs security, and my 4K night vision cameras captured every single humiliating second of her vandalism. I didn't even confront her. I simply forwarded the crystal-clear, cinematic footage directly to the Orange County Sheriff's Department and the Mission Viejo Code Enforcement, resulting in a devastating combination of criminal vandalism citations, heavy municipal fines, and the absolute, total destruction of her social standing in the neighborhood, a public shaming so profound, so complete, that within 2 months, a for sale sign quietly appeared on her manicured lawn, and she vanished, retreating to some wealthy enclave in Scottsdale, Arizona, driven out not by violence, but by the sheer, crushing weight of her own weaponized entitlement being reflected right back at her. The weekend she finally moved, the heavy moving trucks pulling away, taking the dark cloud of her presence with them. My wife and I opened the heavy iron gates, dragging our grill out onto the freshly swept asphalt of our sacred, heavily fortified driveway, throwing a massive, neighborhood-wide block party. The air filled with the smell of barbecue, the sound of children laughing, and the clinking of beers, as neighbors I had never even spoken to came up to shake my hand, thanking me for doing what they had all been too afraid to do, turning my wall of spite into a monument of community liberation. And yet, late at night, when the house is quiet and I sit in my office, looking out the window at the imposing, dark silhouette of the iron gate standing guard under the moonlight, a heavy, complex thought sometimes settles over me. I protected my family, I defended my sanctuary, and I won the war, but in building a wall to keep out a monster, did I let a little bit of that darkness into myself? And is the absolute destruction of another human being's pride ever truly justified? Or are we all just one bad neighbor away from building a fortress of our own?
And we are at the end of the videos. I hope you had a great time watching it. If you had any feedback or suggestion for the future videos, drop them in the comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching and see you next time.